Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Backed by popular demand is the Market Update Show. There's been lots happening in the world, as you very well know, and that really does impact property and the economy. So we're going to run through all the major stories that you need to be aware of.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come to be informed and inspired. This week it's another market update. We're going to be talking about inflation, interest rates, evictions, and of course property prices. So don't go anywhere because you're not going to want to miss any of it.
But before we start, there's something else you won't want to miss, and that's the opportunity to get your hands on the last Property Hub magazine this year. The last issue is dropping in November. If you want it and you're not already a subscriber, you've got till the 9th of October to get involved. It's only £5 a copy delivered, which is a bargain, and you can get the online access to all the digital copies from the past, so an incredible deal. And the reason why we're so excited by this one is that we're looking at the lessons learned from 2020, and let's face it, there's a lot of those. And we've got an interview with rugby legend Ollie Phillips following his property investment journey. So it's an absolutely brilliant issue. I can't wait to get my hands on it. Make sure you get your hands on it as well. Go to propertyhub.net/magazine.
And as if that weren't enough to keep you busy, we've also got a new YouTube video where we're talking about 6 ways to raise the funds to build your property portfolio. That's getting a really nice reaction, so you'll find a link to that in the show notes, or you can just search Property Hub UK on YouTube.
So Rob, another month passes and another easy episode for us because there is so much happening right now in the world. And at the moment with COVID on the increase and trending upwards, which is not a good thing, the government bringing in new restrictions, that's had a big impact on the economy and the property market. The restrictions we're not going to go over too much because they've been well covered by the mainstream media, but the impact of those restrictions, Rob, we absolutely need to look at.
Yeah, of course. Nothing that's been announced directly affects property, so you'll still be able to transact, do viewings, do everything else. It's more about the change in psychology that these are going to have and what effect that might have on the market. So we'll get to that a little bit later. The first thing that's probably worth mentioning about what's happened is something that's been announced that's not going to happen, and that is the autumn budget. Because basically things are still changing all the time and it's impossible for the government to know how much they're planning to spend on anything or what to do about it in the longer term. They've announced that they're not going to have an autumn budget this year, which I think as property investors we can say is good news, because normally when there's anything in a budget to do with property, it's not good. And a lot of people were particularly worried about capital gains tax because they see that as a tax that might be going up to pay for all the new economic measures. So if that does happen, we've got a little bit longer to wait. It won't be happening this year because of the lack of a budget. And something else that won't be happening is the rental reform bill. This is the one that's meant to get rid of Section 21 permanently, as well as a few other measures in there. That was meant to be being introduced to Parliament this year, but now it's not. Not because the government have changed their mind on it, but just because they don't think it's the right time, and so much of their time is being taken up by other things. So this is very much upset groups like Shelter who really want this to happen. I still believe it eventually will happen, but like the budget, it's been a casualty of everything else that's going on right now.
The Chancellor hasn't gone on holiday though. In place of the budget, he's published the Winter Economy Plan, which is the announcement of some additional support measures from the government. The VAT cut for the hospitality and tourism sector has been extended till March, which is obviously a good thing because that industry in particular has been hit hard. Businesses are getting some flexibility on the bounce back loans and how they can repay them. No huge changes there, but any flexibility has got to be seen again as a positive for the businesses that'll impact. And then, Rob, furlough is coming to an end, and they've introduced a pretty complex scheme in its place.
Yeah, if that's meant to be a lead-in for me to explain it, I'm not going to bite because I don't think I can. I'm just not going to go there. But I'm sure anyone interested can go and find out all about it and read it. Basically, it's nowhere near as generous as furlough. It's designed to protect what they're calling viable jobs. Mainly, it seems like it might be helping those who will be working part-time, whereas previously they would have been full-time because there's not enough work for them at the moment, but at some point there will be again. It basically, I think, looks better to bring that in rather than just whipping furlough away and saying, right, that's it now. But it's nowhere near as generous.
Well, first of all, Rob, you've rumbled me now after all these years on the podcast that when there's anything difficult to explain, I'll lead you in. So now I'm going to have to watch myself. But I agree. The main thing is here, something is better than nothing, but it's a fraction of what the furlough scheme was. The impact of it will be minimal compared to the furlough scheme. So we're really going to have to watch what happens around job numbers over the next few months. And of course, we're going to carry on with the market updates for the rest of the year. So we will report back on that as those numbers come through. Of course, we hope they're positive, but we'll see. Now, something that hasn't had as much attention, but is important to look at, is inflation. Inflation fell from 1% in July to 0.2% in August. And a lot of that will be down to the Help Out to Eat Out scheme and the cut in VAT for various sectors, as we already mentioned. But Rob, that's significant. That is really, really low. It's the lowest inflation's been for a long time.
It is. And the reason this is significant is that the Bank of England has got a target to try to keep inflation at around 2%. For anyone who doesn't know, the reason for that is that governments like mild inflation, because deflation is bad news for the economy. If you know that prices are going to be cheaper next month than they are this month, you're going to delay your purchases, demand's going to fall, and that's bad news all around. For that reason, they like to keep it at 2%, because any lower than that, especially where it is now at 0.1%, is getting dangerously close to deflation, and they like to have a bit of a margin of safety. So when you see inflation falling, one of the things that you might expect the Bank of England to do to try to increase that is to cut interest rates. But Rob, at the moment, interest rates are 0.1%. So if they do that, interest rates will be going negative. Is that going to happen?
Well, it might, because the Bank of England have been defending negative interest rates, but they haven't even done it yet. So the fact that they're going public and saying negative interest rates could work and it's something we must consider is almost like they're trying to prep us all for that to happen. They're pointing out that other countries have implemented negative interest rates and it has had the impact intended. So according to the Bank of England, there is a case for it. The fact that they've gone out of their way to make a case for negative interest rates suggests it will happen. And what does that mean? Well, effectively, it will cost you money to hold money in a bank. And as Rob's already said, the reason for this is because the government wants you to spend. So if you leave your money in your bank, it'll cost you. So the alternative is to invest it in assets that will give you a return or spend it. And that's exactly what the government and the Bank of England right now want you to do. I know there'll be people listening to this who think it's all a bit crazy, but let's face it, this is crazy times. And the reason for that is, again, like Rob said, is the fear of deflation. They want to avoid deflation at all costs. So negative interest rates, if we'd said that at the start of the year when we were looking ahead, I don't think anyone would have accepted it as a possibility, but we live in exceptional times, and it appears that negative interest rates have a real chance of happening this year.
So that's the wider economy. Let's move on to property now and take a look at what's happening there. We've got some other bits to cover as well, but we've got to start by talking about property prices, because that's what everyone's talking about at the moment. They're talking about it because what's happening this year has been so unexpected, this mini boom that we've seen, prices going up, transactions going up, properties selling really quickly. But we're also starting to see headlines now questioning what's going to happen next. So there's a story in the Financial Times titled, "Is the UK's booming housing market heading for a bust?" Basically people saying that with furlough ending and when the stamp duty holiday ends next year, the market might take a turn for the worse. And what we were talking about earlier with new restrictions on socialising might have an impact on that as well. Not because of anything practical, but just the psychology around this. People thinking, oh wow, we might be living with this virus for longer than we thought. We thought it was getting better and now it seems to be kicking around for a while. So of course, it's very difficult to say what is going to happen next. We're going to need to have a punt at it at the end of the year when we get to our predictions episode. But Rob, do you want to have a go in the meantime?
You're getting me back for earlier and putting me on the spot now. You know, it's interesting, Rob, it's easy to make a case for property prices falling, but it was easy to make a case for property prices falling a few months ago. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the stamp duty holiday and whether that's extended. And of course, the other big event happening next year is Help to Buy is meant to be ending as well. If both happen at the same time, then yes, it is easy to anticipate property prices dipping and falling. But the big one for me, and one that's not getting talked about, is lending and the availability of credit. Because right now, the mortgage market is an absolute nightmare. Transactions are taking forever to go through. And a large part of that is that the mortgage companies are so slow. And that is in part because of the demand. But because they're in so much demand, or at least partly because of the demand, the products that they're offering right now are rubbish compared to what they were 12 months ago, but particularly for first-time buyers. The products available to first-time buyers right now are massively reduced from where they were a year ago, and in some cases the amount of capital required to put in has increased, or the amount you need to be earning as individuals has increased. So it's making it really difficult for that segment of the market, and the proportion of first-time buyers, which is normally really strong and makes up the majority of buyers, in the housing market is actually falling for the first time in a long time. So this could be temporary, and the lenders might get their act together and then go, wait, we want to take advantage of this and expand their offerings. But if they carry on as they are, they could actually be responsible for the downfall of the market. And everyone will point blame elsewhere, but actually it's the lending that we need to keep our eye on. No one's really talking about it, but for me, I think it's critical.
I agree. You don't see that mentioned in any of the news stories around this. It does seem like a factor that people are missing. And I know I put you on the spot. I'm not willing to put my neck on the line with a prediction just yet. We'll wait a couple of months for that. But I will say it's probably not worth paying too much attention to all the various news stories you see with all their various predictions about what is going to happen, because they've all been so wrong this year. I think Savills said that prices would be down 10%, and of course they're going to be up. The CEBR said that they were going to be down, I think it was 14-15%. They're saying that's going to happen next year instead of this year. And yes, like you said, Rob, you can easily build a case for that. But apart from the stamp duty holiday, which was possibly unexpected, all the other information was out there and everyone got it spectacularly wrong. And you didn't have to be a genius to see that there'd be pent-up demand after lockdown and that people would have been doing pretty well in terms of their personal finances during lockdown. And until furlough ends, people aren't coming under any real pressure. And therefore, there was no trigger for a fall like that. You didn't have to be a genius to predict that because we're not geniuses and we said it a few months ago. So I'm not saying that prices are not going to fall next year. I don't know what's going to happen next year, but I do know that all the main predictions were spectacularly wrong this year. So I'd be very surprised if anything you see being bandied around at the moment is going to turn out to be completely on the nose for 2021. So that's property prices. There's a couple of other things going on regarding property as well this month. First of all, evictions have restarted. If you remember, we talked about in the last market update how the courts reopening had been pushed back by a month. Predictably, a month later, when they're just meant to be reopened, a lot of people had the same push to delay it yet again, but it didn't happen. Evictions have restarted. It's too early to say at the moment how long it's taking for cases to get through. A couple of bits I've heard anecdotally suggest that court dates are coming through a long, long way in the future and they're trying to prioritise the most serious cases. But what I will say about evictions now is that it's very complicated. There are specific things that you need to do now that you didn't have to do before as temporary measures, and the courts will be looking for any reason to chuck cases out to reduce their workload. So if you are unlucky enough to have a situation at the moment where you need to make an eviction, definitely consider taking advice because it's rarely straightforward, but it's on a whole different level at the moment.
And last week we teased that this week we were going to talk about up to 6% of the property market being mortgage prisoners. And this again to me seems incredible that it's not being talked more about. It's something that we've seen, we've been exposed to as a property investor myself and been affected by. As of yet, the mainstream media has been picked up in the Times, but the mainstream media hasn't really covered this story. And the story starts after the Grenfell tragedy and the cladding issues that were clearly present on that building. And the government, quite understandably, said, right, okay, we need to address this. And with RICS, they created the EWS1. And EWS stands for External Wall System. Now, we won't get into all the technicalities of this, but basically, an EWS1 sign-off means that your building is now safe. And they'll go in, check it, survey it, and make sure that the cladding used is completely fine. If it's not, then your property will probably be unmortgageable until it's resolved. And what properties are affected? Well, initially, it was for properties that were 18 metres or taller. And this happened in 2019. So that's about 6 stories and up. So really the taller buildings, the city centre stuff. And about 1,000 of those high-rise buildings had been signed off already. And it was going well until earlier this year, the government just slid in a little bit extra and went, well, actually, any building with cladding needs checking now. And the impact of that was huge. It doesn't sound like it'd be huge, but it was huge because there was already a strain on that sector to get through all the high-rise buildings, and they hadn't done it yet. There was already a backlog. And now all apartment blocks with cladding that were built before 2018 need to have an EW1 sign-off. The consequence of not having it may mean that you can't remortgage or get a new mortgage if you bought cash. The cost of them varies, but it could be 10 to 20 grand. That's not per individual, that's per block. So in larger schemes, the cost per owner is not that high. It is a pain in the bum, and as I said, there's a backlog. And those buildings that are failing the checks, obviously the costs are a lot higher. Fortunately, there's not as many of those buildings, but it has happened. And in some cases, it's meant that buildings have had to have 24-hour security on those buildings for somebody to keep an eye on them because they're seen as a fire risk, which means that your service charges are going up. So not a great situation for those people and not a situation that's talked about a lot. But this story develops further. Because, as I've already touched on, buildings from 2018 onwards, that have been built from 2018 onwards, haven't needed this check. But lenders are still so new to this situation that they've kind of panicked and overreacted. And even though building regs have been in place since 2018 with the requirement for you to build it with the right type of cladding, and therefore these forms shouldn't be needed, mortgage companies are telling developers now, we still want it. But this is news to developers, and often at completion is causing last-minute delays because they're scrambling around to get this sorted. But as we've said, there's a backlog, so it means that some developments have now started seeing delays, which is not necessarily great for those who bought off-plan and are keen to complete, but it's also not great for the developers who may have finance against that building and are waiting on completion to repay it, and suddenly the finance costs start to increase. So what initially seemed as a bit of a niche story is impacting the whole world of apartments. Does this mean you need to avoid apartments? No. What you need is to make sure your developer is aware of it if you're buying new build, and if you're buying a second-hand apartment, then you just need to check that it has an EW1S sign-off. So for people purchasing now, it's not that big of a deal. It's just an extra admin check you need to think about. But for those who already own or are completing now and the developers just realised that they need that form, it's a bit of a headache. Rob, it's a bit of a niche story, but it's impacting a lot of property owners and investors.
Yeah, it is. Is this something that wasn't really on my radar till recently? But I've got friends who live in a block that is only 3 stories high. So you would have thought it wouldn't need one of these forms. Doesn't even look like it's got any cladding on it. But my friends are trying to remortgage. The lender is saying that they do want to see one of these forms. And the freeholder of the block is saying, well, we're not going to pay for one. It doesn't need it. So what are you meant to do in that situation? I don't know. But I think because it's all so new and so unclear, there are going to be lots of people in situations like this. I'd like to think that over the next year, the government or the body that regulates lenders or someone like that will step in and provide a bit of clarity and help to make this issue less widespread and kind of focus it on where it's really needed. But at the moment, it certainly is a bit of a mess. So that is it for this month's market update. Again, absolutely loads going on. Of course, keep on listening to the Property Podcast every week because we always have our news story where we'll let you know the latest about what's happening. But we love these market updates as a chance to round everything up, cover anything we might have missed and pass on some of what we've seen from operating in the market every day like we do. So like Rob said earlier, we'll keep doing them for the rest of the year. So listen out for the next one in a month's time. On now to our success stories. Every week we love to share the story of a listener who's taken the information that we put out on the podcast and used it to go out and do something that's made a real difference to their life. And we've got one this week in the form of a podcast review from Stretch6110, who says, I can't thank you guys enough for the amazing content. This is life-changing stuff. In the space of 5 years, I've gone from a professional musician with no pension and no prospect for a comfortable retirement to owning 5 properties. The yield from these has been a lifesaver throughout COVID. Your content gave me the confidence and information to make the right decisions throughout. Well, that is absolutely brilliant. Well done to you. 5 properties in 5 years is quite something. And having the confidence to take that action at a time like the last 5 years when there's been so much crazy stuff going on is really fantastic. So thank you for the podcast review and well done to you.
So that's us done for another week. We'll be back on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob. And of course, we'll be back on Thursday with a very special interview for the Property Podcast. But until then, have fun, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.